The night was cold across the American heartland when the news spread. Abraham Lincoln had been elected President of the United States. Bells rang in northern towns, newspapers rushed to print extras, and crowds gathered beneath gas-lit windows to cheer. Yet even as the celebrations echoed, another sound began to rise from the South, the quiet tearing of a nation in two. No cannon had fired, no soldiers had marched, but the Union was already breaking. What had been decided at the ballot box in November 1860 would soon be tested on the battlefield. This is the story of how victory turned to crisis, how politics became rebellion, and how the idea of America itself began to unravel. In the autumn of 1860, the United States was a country suspended between pride and panic. Lincoln's victory was decisive in the Electoral College, but narrow in the popular vote. Less than 40% of Americans had chosen him. His name had not even appeared on most Southern ballots. To the people of the Deep South, it was not merely a political defeat, but an existential one. They saw in Lincoln and his Republican Party a direct threat to their way of life, their economy, and their honor. Newspapers in Charleston and New Orleans declared that the Union is dissolved. Sermons warned that the North would soon send armies to free the enslaved and overturn the Southern order. Fear and fury spread faster than fact. Lincoln, in Springfield, Illinois, read the reports with a mix of disbelief and resolve. He had campaigned on stopping the expansion of slavery, not its immediate abolition. He had promised to respect the rights of the states where slavery already existed. But his words could not calm a region convinced that the world it had built was under siege. The South did not wait to see what Lincoln would do. It acted on what it believed he intended to do. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. The vote in Charleston was unanimous. When the news reached the crowd outside, church bells rang, cannons roared over the harbor, and men wept with joy. They believed they were living the Second American Revolution, freeing themselves from tyranny, as their fathers had done in 1776. The Palmetto flag rose above Fort Moultrie, and the federal garrison withdrew to the more defensible Fort Sumter. Across the South, secession was no longer a theory. It was a movement. In the weeks that followed, the rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. Mississippi left the Union on January 9, 1861. Florida followed the next day, then Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Each state issued its own declaration of causes, documents that spoke of liberty and rights but circled, again and again, around the defense of slavery. The words were plain. They seceded because they believed Lincoln's government would destroy the institution upon which their wealth and power rested. In Washington, the scene was one of paralysis. President James Buchanan, in the final months of his term, declared that secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no power to stop it. His inaction left federal forts, arsenals, and courthouses scattered across the South vulnerable. One by one, they were seized by local militias flying the banners of their states. The authority of the Union was dissolving in real time. Diplomats resigned. Army officers from southern states began to send in their commissions, torn between duty and home. The halls of Congress, once filled with debate, now echoed with absence. Southern senators and representatives walked out, some with tears, others with defiance. In the galleries, spectators watched as the fragile experiment of the United States began to fracture before their eyes. The press called it the Great Secession Winter. In the North, the mood swung between disbelief and outrage. Many hoped the crisis would somehow pass, that tempers would cool, and that compromise, America's favorite tradition, would once again hold the Union together. But each passing week made that hope harder to believe. In the South, the rhetoric of revolution deepened. Newspapers compared Lincoln to a tyrant. Public meetings passed resolutions of independence. Bands played Dixie in the streets. Ordinary people, farmers, and planters alike, pledged to defend their states against invasion. Young men drilled with muskets on courthouse lawns, while women sewed flags and cheered them on. The idea of secession, once radical, had become patriotic. To oppose it was to betray your home. Yet even amid the celebration, uncertainty lingered. What would the North do? Would Lincoln send troops? Would there be war? Many Southerners still hoped the separation could be peaceful, a divorce rather than a death. Others believed that once the deed was done, the North would have no choice but to accept it. But history rarely bends to hope. Lincoln remained in Springfield, preparing for a presidency unlike any in American history. Each day brought new reports of forts seized and arsenals captured. He received threats on his life in the mail. His advisors urged caution. The president-elect wrote letters quietly, calmly, reminding friends that the Union was older than the states, that it was not a mere contract to be broken, but a bond born of revolution and blood. Still, he knew that words alone could not mend the break. As the year turned 1861, the nation faced the unthinkable. 7 states had declared independence. The federal government seemed powerless to respond. The once proud Union flag now represented authority that no longer reached half its territory. In Charleston Harbor, the garrison at Fort Sumter, barely 70 men, stood as the last visible symbol of federal power in the South. The city around them treated the fort like a provocation, a foreign post on sovereign soil. Every day, more Confederate guns were mounted along the shore. In the North, the reality of secession began to sink in. For decades, politicians had warned that the Union might one day split, but few had believed it could truly happen. Now rail lines were cut, telegraph lines severed, trade disrupted. The nation that had once spoken proudly of manifest destiny, of its unstoppable march westward, found itself unable even to hold together its own states. Markets trembled, families divided, preachers in both North and South invoked God to justify their cause. The language of compromise was giving way to the language of conviction. Amid this chaos, a few men still tried to find a way back. Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a final compromise, restoring the old Missouri Compromise line, protecting slavery south of it, banning it north. Lincoln refused to support it. He could not, he said, sanction the spread of slavery once more. To the South, his silence was proof of hostility. To the North, it was principle. The gap between those two interpretations had become an abyss. In January 1861, as Southern delegates met to discuss forming their own government, Lincoln began the long journey from Springfield to Washington. His friends begged him not to go. Rumors of assassination swirled. He traveled part of the way in secrecy, switching trains in the night. When he finally reached the capital, the city was tense, its streets patrolled by soldiers, its public buildings guarded against mobs. The air was heavy with dread. No president had ever arrived under such circumstances. Back in the seceded states, excitement grew. Flags bearing a single star or 7 stars waved from courthouses and ships. Newspapers in Montgomery, Alabama, printed calls for unity among the independent republics of the South. They spoke openly of a new nation, one founded on the principles of states' rights and the permanence of slavery. By the end of January, the framework of that nation was already being drawn. Within weeks, it would have a constitution, a president, and an army. Meanwhile, the North struggled to understand what had truly been lost. Many still called for restraint, insisting that the Union should not strike first. They spoke of fraternity and reason, as if the storm could still be calmed. But reason had long since given way to emotion. The republic that had survived wars, depressions, and political crises now faced something deeper, a fracture of faith. By February, even moderate voices were beginning to harden. The realization spread that the Union could not be saved without force, and that the time for reconciliation might already be past. The winter of 1860-61 was unlike any other in the nation's history. Silent, tense, filled with dread. It was a season of waiting, of slow-motion collapse. In Charleston, men watched the flag over Fort Sumter through telescopes, waiting for the day it would come down. In Washington, the new president prepared to take an oath to defend a constitution already half abandoned. Between them lay a gulf of mistrust that words could no longer bridge. The question now was not whether the Union would endure, but how it would fall, and who would strike first. The ballots of November had become the battle lines of January. The dream of a single nation was dying, replaced by 2 rival visions of destiny. Each side believed it was defending liberty. Each believed God and history stood with them. Neither could imagine how terrible the cost would be. The storm that had been gathering for decades was about to break. Soon, cannons would roar, flags would change, and the United States of America would enter its darkest trial. The age of compromise was over. The age of conflict had begun. The winter sun hung low over Montgomery, Alabama, casting long shadows across the red clay streets. On February 4, 1861, carriages clattered toward the Capitol building, where delegates from the seceded states gathered to give shape to their rebellion. Inside, beneath the white dome that gleamed against a cloudless sky, they declared the birth of a new nation, the Confederate States of America. It was a scene charged with pride and peril. Flags stitched by Southern women fluttered from balconies. Bands played triumphant marches. Ministers offered prayers of blessing. The mood was one of destiny fulfilled, not treason committed. They believed they were carrying forward the spirit of 1776, that they, not the Union they had left behind, were the true heirs of the Revolution. The Confederacy was born in a hall thick with rhetoric about liberty and independence, but at its heart lay a truth the delegates did not hide. Their new Constitution, modeled closely on the United States, was nearly identical in its language, except for one defining addition. Where the American Constitution had been silent on slavery, the Confederate one was explicit. It guaranteed the right to own human beings, declaring slavery the natural and normal condition of black people. This was not a revolution against tyranny. It was a revolution to preserve one. And yet, for those men gathered in Montgomery, it felt righteous. They believed their economy, their culture, and their very existence depended on maintaining what they called the cornerstone of their civilization. While the South celebrated, the North watched in disbelief. Newspapers in New York and Philadelphia printed the news with grim fascination. Was this truly happening? Was the Union, the great experiment of freedom and democracy, dissolving before their eyes? For many, it still seemed unimaginable that Americans could go to war against Americans. Surely, they thought, cooler heads would prevail. But the distance between the two sides was no longer political. It was spiritual. By mid-February, the Confederate Congress had chosen its leader, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. A West Point graduate, former U.S. Senator, and Secretary of War, Davis was no firebrand. He was serious, disciplined, and deeply loyal to his home state. When the telegram reached him on his plantation, he accepted the presidency with reluctance, saying he felt as though he were being crucified for the sins of others. Davis's journey to Montgomery was slow and ceremonial. At every station, crowds gathered to cheer, wave flags, and throw flowers. Women presented him with laurel wreaths. Old soldiers saluted as if welcoming a conqueror. When he arrived, he was greeted like a hero of legend, the embodiment of the new Confederacy. On February 18th, he stood on the steps of the Alabama state capitol to deliver his inaugural address. The day was bright and cold. Cannon fire echoed through the streets as he took the oath of office. Davis's speech was calm, deliberate, and confident. He denied that secession was rebellion. It was, he said, the lawful act of sovereign states choosing independence. The Confederacy sought peace, not war. But, he warned, if the aggrieved states are determined to make war upon us, we will meet it and defend our rights. The crowd erupted in cheers. Bands struck up Dixie, and flags waved in a sea of color. For a moment, the Confederacy seemed not a desperate gamble, but a nation fully born. Yet even in that moment of celebration, cracks were visible beneath the surface. The new government had no navy, no treasury, no recognized allies abroad. Its economy depended entirely on cotton exports, and it assumed naively that Europe's hunger for cotton would force Britain and France to recognize its independence. The delegates believed time was on their side, that the North would never fight to preserve a union that so many in its own ranks were ready to let go. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln prepared to prove them wrong. Lincoln's journey to the Capitol in February 1861 was a journey through a divided land. From Springfield, Illinois, he boarded a train that wound slowly eastward, stopping in cities and towns where thousands came to see him. He was not yet the solemn figure of later photographs, but a man visibly burdened by the weight of history. In Cincinnati, he urged calm. In Columbus, he spoke of duty. In Pittsburgh, he reminded citizens that secession was unlawful. At every stop, he tried to balance reassurance with resolve, promising not to interfere with slavery where it existed, yet refusing to recognize the Confederacy as legitimate. Still, the atmosphere grew more tense with every mile. Rumors of assassination plots reached his ears. In Baltimore, his aides intercepted a credible plan to kill him as he passed through the station. At the advice of the Pinkerton detectives, Lincoln altered his route and slipped through the city in the dead of night, disguised in an overcoat and soft cap. When he finally arrived in Washington on February 23rd, it was under cover of darkness. Critics mocked him for sneaking into the Capitol like a thief in the night, but the danger had been real. The city itself was barely loyal. Southern sympathizers filled the streets, and many in the federal government secretly supported secession. The Capitol dome was unfinished, a fitting symbol of a union still under construction, and now on the brink of collapse. Inside the White House, the mood was somber. Buchanan was leaving office as the most unpopular president in the nation's short history. The once great statesman was now an old man, exhausted and defeated, happy to escape the burden of responsibility. When he met Lincoln, he reportedly sighed and said, "If you are as happy, my dear sir, on entering this house as I am on leaving it, you are the happiest man in the country." Lincoln smiled politely, but he understood the truth. The house he was entering was one filled with ghosts. The inauguration took place on March 4th, 1861. The sky was clear but cold, the air thick with unease. Soldiers lined Pennsylvania Avenue, rifles ready. Sharp-eyed men scanned rooftops for assassins. For the first time in American history, the capital city resembled an armed camp. Lincoln stepped forward, tall and solemn, his stovepipe hat in hand. The crowd before him was restless, some hopeful, some defiant. His words, though calm, carried the weight of a dying nation. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." He spoke directly to the South, appealing not to politics but to shared memory. The mystic chords of memory, he called them, that stretched from every patriot grave to every living heart. But behind the poetry lay firmness. Secession, he declared, was illegal. The Union was perpetual. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." There was no applause when he finished, only silence, heavy and uncertain. Then the crowd dispersed, the soldiers relaxed, and the new president returned to the White House. The Union still existed, but barely. Beyond the Capitol, events were moving faster than speeches could stop them. In Montgomery, Davis formed his cabinet and began organizing an army. Former U.S. arsenals were emptied, ships seized, forts surrounded. The Confederate government sent envoys to Washington to negotiate recognition, but Lincoln refused to meet them. To do so, he reasoned, would acknowledge the very thing he denied, that the Union was broken. Meanwhile, across the North, public opinion was shifting. Many still called for peace, but others began to demand action. They saw in the Confederate seizure of federal property not negotiation, but rebellion. Lincoln's advisors urged him to hold firm, to do nothing rash but also nothing weak. The symbol of that policy would be Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Inside the fort, Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison waited, cut off and running low on supplies. Confederate guns surrounded them, and the people of Charleston watched daily, expecting an attack. The situation was untenable, but for Lincoln it was also a test. If he abandoned the fort, the Union would seem to accept secession. If he tried to reinforce it, the Confederacy might strike. Either way, the moment of decision was near. In the North, newspapers speculated endlessly. In the South, militias drilled on beaches, and cannons were aimed toward the harbor. Diplomats abroad watched with morbid curiosity. Could the great American Republic really tear itself apart? While Lincoln deliberated, Jefferson Davis acted. He authorized his government to prepare for defense, or if necessary, offense. The new Confederacy was eager to prove its legitimacy through strength. It issued currency, printed stamps, and declared itself at peace with all nations, except the United States. The contrast between the two presidents was striking. Lincoln quiet and deliberate, searching for a way to preserve the Union without bloodshed. Davis confident and combative, determined to defend his new nation's honor. Both men believed they were fighting for the same cause, liberty. Both prayed for peace, but on their own terms. Neither could yield. As March drew to a close, the divide had become irreversible. Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy. Davis refused to return to the Union. Every message exchange between Washington and Montgomery only deepened the misunderstanding. The political bridges were gone. Only the military ones remained, and they were already burning. The Confederacy's leaders prepared for the worst. Men enlisted by the thousands, drilling under banners of stars and bars. Families sent their sons off with pride and fear. Ministers preached that God stood with the South. In northern cities, meanwhile, men gathered around telegraph offices, waiting for the news they all knew was coming. 2 capitals, 2 presidents, 2 flags, and 1 continent trembling between them. The Union and the Confederacy now faced each other like mirrors, each claiming to be the true America. The months between January and March 1861 were the birth pains of a new, uncertain age. The world had witnessed revolutions before, in France, in Haiti, in Europe's restless kingdoms, but none like this. This was not empire against colony or people against king. This was a nation divided against itself, its 2 halves bound by memory, yet driven apart by conviction. By the end of March, the first warm winds of spring swept through the country. The snow melted, rivers rose, and so did tempers. Fort Sumter still flew the stars and stripes defiantly against the gray horizon of Charleston. The Confederacy waited, daring Lincoln to act. The Union hesitated, unwilling to fire the first shot. In Montgomery, Jefferson Davis wrote to his generals, "The moment of decision is close at hand." And in Washington, Abraham Lincoln sat in his study, his hands clasped, the weight of the nation pressing on his shoulders. He knew that his next move might determine the fate of millions. The old Union had vanished. In its place stood 2 nations, both certain of their righteousness, both unwilling to bend. The fuse had been lit, and all that remained was for someone somewhere to strike the match. The storm was ready to break, and when it did, it would echo from Charleston Harbor to every corner of the divided republic. Stay with us, and subscribe as the next chapter unfolds, when the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter, and America's greatest war begins. The dawn broke over Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, painted in hues of orange and smoke. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but in the hearts of men there was only tension. The silence before the storm had lasted too long, and now every cannon in the harbor waited for a single word to unleash it. In the gray light of morning, Major Robert Anderson, commander of the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, stood on the ramparts, peering toward the Confederate batteries that encircled him. For weeks he had waited, trapped, undersupplied, and uncertain, as the standoff between North and South turned into a national fever. His men were weary, living on salt pork and stale bread, their uniforms ragged, their powder running low. But the flag still flew above them, the stars and stripes rippling defiantly over a hostile city. Across the harbor, Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard stood at his command post, scanning the same sky. He had once been Anderson's student at West Point. Now, teacher and pupil faced each other as enemies. Between them lay the question that diplomacy had failed to answer. Would the Union surrender peacefully, or would war decide the future? The night before, after weeks of negotiation, Confederate envoys had demanded Anderson's surrender. He refused, offering instead to leave the fort in a few days, but only if he received no further orders or supplies from Washington. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States, saw that as an unacceptable delay. In Montgomery, his cabinet debated deep into the night. At 3:20 a.m., Davis's telegram reached Beauregard. The words were short, cold, and final. "If you have no doubt of your ability to reduce Fort Sumter, you are authorized to do so." At 4:30 a.m., as darkness still cloaked the harbor, a single mortar shell arced into the sky from Fort Johnson, bursting in white fire over the water. It was the signal. A moment later, the Confederate batteries opened fire. The first cannonball streaked through the air and crashed against Fort Sumter's walls. The war that everyone had feared and many had predicted and had begun. The roar was deafening. The city of Charleston awoke to the thunder of artillery. Crowds gathered on rooftops and along the shore, watching in awe as flashes of light lit the horizon. Some cheered, some prayed. Women waved handkerchiefs and men shouted, "Fire again!" as if the bombardment were a spectacle. But beneath the excitement there was something darker, an understanding that what had been unleashed could never be undone. Inside Fort Sumter, Anderson's men scrambled to their stations. Cannonballs smashed through walls, splintering brick and iron. The men returned fire, but their guns were fewer, their aim hindered by the fort's design. Smoke choked the corridors. Ammunition was scarce. By midday, the fort was a furnace of noise and dust. Anderson ordered the men to ration their gunpowder. Every shot had to count. From the city, Beauregard watched the fort's flag still standing, tattered but unbowed. The bombardment continued through the night. Sparks set the officers' quarters ablaze. Flames spread unchecked, lighting the harbor with an eerie orange glow. The men fought the fire as they fought the enemy, dragging water by bucket, coughing through smoke. Still, not one life was lost. It was a battle of will, not blood. But that would soon change. For 34 hours, the guns roared. The echoes carried across the Atlantic coast, through the plantations of Georgia, the mountains of Tennessee, the factories of Pennsylvania. News traveled by telegraph faster than any war in history had before. "The war has opened," cried the headlines. In the north, people gathered around bulletin boards to read dispatches from Charleston. In the south, church bells rang in triumph. The die was cast. On April 13th, as the fort's walls crumbled and the fires raged out of control, Anderson faced the inevitable. His supplies were gone, his men exhausted. At 2 p.m., he ordered the Union flag lowered. A white flag went up in its place. The bombardment ceased. Silence fell over the harbor. Not the silence of peace, but of shock. The Confederates allowed Anderson and his men to evacuate with honor. They saluted their flag before leaving, firing a final cannon salute. But even that gesture turned grim. During the ceremony, an accidental explosion killed one Union soldier. The first fatality of a war that would claim more than 600,000 lives. As the smoke cleared, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. There was no longer any talk of reconciliation. The war that had begun with speeches and petitions had now found its voice in cannon fire. When word reached Washington, Lincoln acted swiftly. On April 15, 1861, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Men rushed to enlist, marching through city streets singing the Star-Spangled Banner and the battle cry of freedom. Flags waved from every window. For a brief, shining moment, the Union stood united again, not in politics but in purpose. In the South, that same call was seen as an act of war. Lincoln's demand for troops confirmed every fear of tyranny. The remaining slave states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, now faced a terrible choice. One by one, they joined the Confederacy. Richmond became the new Confederate capital. The map of the United States, once seamless, was now scarred by division. The lines were drawn. On one side stood the Union, industrial, populous, driven by the promise of liberty. On the other, the Confederacy, agricultural, defiant, determined to preserve its way of life. Both claimed the mantle of freedom. Both invoked the spirit of 1776. But only one would survive. As spring deepened, soldiers in blue and gray began to move. Trains carried regiments toward Washington and Richmond. Town squares filled with farewells, wives weeping, mothers clutching letters to sons who might never return. The sound of fifes and drums echoed through the valleys and along the rivers. The war everyone had sworn to avoid had become the war no one could stop. In Charleston, where it had all begun, the Confederate flag flew proudly over Fort Sumter. Church bells rang again, this time for Sunday services. Ministers preached that the Lord had blessed their cause. But even amid victory, the city knew it had become a target. War had consecrated its harbor, and soon it would return. In Washington, Lincoln walked the dim halls of the White House, weary but resolute. He understood what had been unleashed. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "We are in the midst of a great revolution. It will be long and it will be bloody. His cabinet divided over strategy. Should the Union strike swiftly or build its strength? Lincoln's mind was clear. The Union must stand. No compromise, no retreat. The flag lowered at Fort Sumter would rise again. Jefferson Davis, meanwhile, exulted. "The war is ours," he declared to his Congress in Montgomery. "We meet it not with fear, but with confidence." Yet even as he spoke, he knew the North's industrial might, its ships, its railroads, and its sheer numbers. The South's triumph at Sumter was symbolic, but symbols in war have power, and for the moment that power belonged to the Confederacy. The rest of the world watched with fascination. European newspapers called it the American tragedy. Monarchs and ministers speculated on how long the Republic would last. Few believed the Union could restore itself. Many predicted the North would let the South go, and the United States would split forever into rival nations. They underestimated Lincoln's resolve and the terrible price he was willing to pay to preserve the Union. As April turned to May, the first armies began to assemble. Volunteers drilled in open fields, their uniforms mismatched, their weapons old but their spirits fierce. Towns rang with patriotic speeches. Women sewed regimental flags, whispering prayers into every stitch. The nation was awakening to its own power and its own destruction. In Virginia, the old General Robert E. Lee faced a choice. Offered command of the Union Army, he refused, torn between country and state. "I cannot draw my sword against my native Virginia," he said. His decision would shape the course of the war. Across the South, men like him, once loyal to the United States, now turned their allegiance to the Confederacy. The first battles were still weeks away, but the nation already felt the pulse of war. In every parlor and tavern, people spoke of Sumter, of Lincoln, of Davis. Songs were written overnight. Newspapers filled their pages with maps, troop lists, and speculation. It was as if the entire continent had drawn in its breath, waiting for the next thunderclap. Fort Sumter had been a small outpost, barely a speck on the map, but its fall had shaken the world. The cannon that fired over Charleston Harbor did more than shatter brick and stone. They shattered illusion, the illusion that America could compromise forever, that slavery and freedom could coexist under the same flag. That time alone would heal what history had wounded. The first shots of the Civil War were not only the sound of rebellion, they were the sound of reckoning. Every decision postponed, every injustice ignored, every warning unheeded had finally come due. And so, with the smoke still hanging over Charleston, and the echoes of cannon still rolling across the sea, the United States marched into its darkest hour. Brothers would fight brothers, neighbors would become enemies, towns would burn and fields would run red. But in that darkness, a new purpose began to take shape. A struggle not just for the Union's survival, but for the meaning of freedom itself. The flag that fell at Fort Sumter would one day rise again, but not before the nation paid the highest price for its redemption. Stay with us. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode of this epic story. When America goes to war with itself, and the fields of Virginia, Tennessee, and Maryland echo with the sound of history's most terrible reckoning.